going to put my little timer on here so I don't talk your ears off too long, but do really want to thank all of you for coming out today to learn more about community development financial institutions, CDFIs, and also some of the work that we're doing with Invest in Wisconsin, a collaborative of 4 Wisconsin-based CDFIs, and specifically in the space of social impact investment. And I'll tell you that this is, it's new in our space to a certain degree. We have probably more questions than answers, so I don't come to you thinking that I have the golden ticket, but perhaps just some nice lessons learned from the last year and a half of our work together. So really excited to be here again and give you a quick preview of what we'll be talking about today. So again, what are community development financial institutions, CDFIs, some of the work of Wisconsin CDFIs in general, specifically looking at Invest in Wisconsin, and then we'll get into the social impact. First, looking at a series of 5 case studies that Invest in Wisconsin did in the past year. So they started on those case studies. I'll also kind of foreshadow a little bit of the work that we've been doing around implementing a social impact, kind of more quantitative platform, and some of the challenges that we have encountered in just the beginning. And of course, leave some time for questions at the end. And of course, do feel free to ask any questions at any time. I'm hoping this is just going to be a kind of a conversational dialogue among all of us. So starting out, CDFIs, what are they? If you don't know, we were in the same boat very recently. I've been working at my job for over a year. Before that, heard about CDFIs, but what they are is institutions that function to serve the under and unbankable, whether that's individuals who are interested in starting a small business or nonprofits that are interested in addressing the needs of underserved communities. And we as CDFIs receive our funding from a variety of different sources that are up here. So often a lot of our funding comes directly from the banks, who understand that with what would be traditionally considered a high-risk client, they might not have the resources and infrastructure to support that individual or organization in carrying out their financial plans, and they look to us and know that with the resources we're able to do that. Public and private foundations, think Rockefeller, Kresge, several big organizations that support the work that we do in community. Social impact investors, which may be individuals who are saying, I'm looking for some kind of small return on my investment, but really it's about creating equitable change in communities by shifting power, shifting dollars to those who might not traditionally have it. We also get money from the CDFI fund, the government Department of Treasury at the federal level. Of course, like most folks these days, we are experiencing impending cuts to that program. Given though that some of our other sources of funding are quite large, we still should be able to move forward as CDFIs. More to come as we learn. What we do with that money then is invest in a variety of different enterprises, whether that's a micro enterprise, a very small business, and then larger but still small businesses. Affordable housing is a big one. Community facilities that include things like community health care centers, also daycares, childcare, a variety of food, economic development systems, education. And then some CDFIs also invest in individuals who are first-time home buyers, also folks looking to buy cars who might not be able to access transportation. That's a huge thing that we find, of course, in rural areas, comes up all the time in conversations with communities. And we'd like to talk about how we recycle funds within communities. And there are all sorts of kind of ratios that are thrown out there. One of the nicer ones is kind of for every $1, we recycle it 12 times within communities. I've also seen kind of a 1-to-8 ratio, but it's kind of why you often hear CDFIs referred to as a revolving loan fund. The money keeps getting recycled within communities, building equity within communities. So there's quite a diversity of things that we do as CDFIs. And just to give a general overview of how are we different than banks, how are we different than angel investors. CDFIs are generally nonprofits, perhaps all the time nonprofits, Broader lending criteria, lower interest rates for the most part. Sometimes we will see some higher interest rates with the understanding that we're providing a lot more additional services, and in return we see folks, the default rate is very low. People are able to pay us back. Often a smaller loan, certainly again we consider kind of higher risk clients. So for example, one of the CDFIs that I work with in Milwaukee talks about how they've been able to invest in first-time business owners who may have been previously incarcerated, may not have any active credit history or poor credit history, something that that person may never be able to access at a traditional bank. And when we talk about this actively guide businesses and projects to mitigate risk, I've got Samira back here, one of my colleagues at Ford Community Investments. She has several counterparts throughout the state and like organizations, and really provide those critical services and coaching and mentorship that go hand in hand with the investment that we make in individuals and in nonprofits and businesses. So it's the capital, it's the dollars, it's the investments, but it's also that support which then leads to these very low default rates on loans. With banks, and I certainly don't want to knock banks because they're one of our greatest supporters and understand that we really need each other to thrive, but they often have narrower lending criteria, higher interest rates, not looking to take on risk. And it's not really about that technical support for the client. That's not kind of their sweet spot. And angel investors even more so, looking for a very high return on investment, highly risk adverse, not looking to invest in individuals or organizations, again, that may default on loans, and there can be bigger penalties if you do. So kind of a nice summary of what CDFIs do and why we have traditionally been so successful is that we were able to provide access to capital where it generally is not available. And we are all over the place, in rural areas where access is challenging, in urban centers. There are, I want to say thousands, if not hundreds, of CDFIs throughout the country. So in that way, we're not unique in Wisconsin. They're all over the place. And take this very holistic approach to understanding that communities and individuals need more than the dollars. They need the wraparound support, and also an understanding that their economic well-being is bigger than their finances. And as a result, there's a very low default rate on lending. So now I'll just give you some overview of the stats in Wisconsin around our Wisconsin CDFIs. The numbers vary a little bit in terms of how many CDFIs are currently active in Wisconsin, somewhere between 22 and 24 generally. This particular slide highlights the loan activity from 2005 to 2015, which saw nearly $2 billion in investment throughout the state, with that average loan size hovering around 90,000. And you'll see that CDFIs are located in several counties, the green dots, throughout the state, and there are collaboratives between different CDFIs in this state, and sometimes there are CDFI collaboratives regionally. So here's some of the kind of flashy numbers that we like to look at. Kind of number of this is the 2005 to 2015, about $2 billion in loans invested by Wisconsin CDFIs. Over 6,000 units of affordable housing have been developed, nearly 8,000 businesses, and just millions of square footage of nonprofit space, whether it's dedicated to education, again, healthcare, et cetera. Thousands of jobs created and consumers who have been financed. One thing I like to say about this slide in particular is CDFIs really do garner really nice bipartisan support, which is uncommon these days, but when you look at the numbers, our Republican friends love to see nearly 80,000 jobs created in this time period. Our Democratic friends like to see the underserved youth are receiving access to education and to affordable housing. So we've been fairly successful from garnering support on both sides, and this slide kind of gives some insight into why that is, and that's a great thing. So I'll talk now about this specific cohort of CDFIs Invest in Wisconsin, and my role with them is as both the program director, providing some strategic insight into their development and their collaborative work together, and also as the evaluator, which can be a little bit precarious to wear both hats, but we're a small staff, so that's just how it goes sometimes. The collaborative is comprised of 4 organizations. Community Assets for People, this is the one that's a subsidiary of CAP Services. It's the only one of the 4 that's a regional CDFI. They're in the Fox Valley area and have a 6-county spread. They're pretty amazing, because in addition to doing 1,000 other things that I can't even tell you all of them, they also have the CDFI that does work around affordable housing, so first-time mortgages, rehab, loans for rehab to homes, consumer loans that also include auto loans. Transportation comes up, and I mentioned this before, but transportation comes up all the time when we're talking to community members, where it's not just about having the business, but how do you get there, especially when public transportation isn't available. So that's huge, and it's our only CDFI actually of the group that does auto, so I highlight that. And they have a focus around advancing economic equity. We also work with First American Capital Corporation, and they're a native CDFI, actually the first native CDFI in Wisconsin. They're fantastic. They are headquartered in West Allis near Milwaukee, but do a lot of work on and off reservations or in Green Bay. They're all over the place. Mostly SBA loans, small business loans, micro loans, and it's amazing. All of the organizations do this technical support, but as I talk with their borrowers, that is such a critical part of what they do. They're a tiny shop, and that mentoring component is just critical. It comes up all the time. Forward Community Investments, another statewide organization. They're headquartered in Madison. There is another office that recently opened in Milwaukee, but they're also all over the place. Not loans to nonprofit organizations, traditionally around looking at issues of affordable housing, facilities. Again, that can take a variety of forms, and also the technical assistance component with a real emphasis on socioeconomic and racial equity throughout the state. And then the last one is WIBIC, the Wisconsin Women's Business Initiative Corporation, also statewide. They're headquartered in Milwaukee. So they have offices throughout the state. I was actually just at their 30-year anniversary yesterday in Milwaukee. They're an absolutely fantastic organization, focusing more on the small business loans and the micro loans. And as the name might imply that they only serve women, but they actually do serve men as well. But certainly that gender equity component is critical in addition to racial equity. Any questions? I know I've given you a lot of information here. Any questions before I keep plowing through this? No? Okay. Well, if you do, stop me. So the overall mission of Invest in Wisconsin is general. It's to support economic opportunities for low income and people of color in rural Wisconsin. The rural piece really has more to do with kind of an initial funding initiative through JP Morgan Chase through their Pro Neighborhoods program, who kind of really helped sponsor us to get out the door and get started. And the focus on that really was more rural. I would say we're broader than that, but for the focus of kind of our initial work, it's been trying to identify those needs that are specific to rural areas and making sure capital is available there as well. All of the pictures you'll see throughout here are pictures from the partnering organizations or from the work that we've done together as a collaborative. This one's from WIBIC, the Wisconsin Women's Business Initiative Corporation. So one of our, in addition to the lending activity and of course the social impact that I'll talk about, another key component of the work that we're trying to advance is around advocacy. There's never been a more important time to get the message across to our legislators. And again, we've learned from talking with communities that a key resource for them in terms of getting information is often to call their legislators or their staffers. And so this just past May, we organized the first CDFI at the Wisconsin State Capitol, which was a really exciting first-time event. Met with a lot of legislators and staff one-on-one. And again, that bipartisan buy-in and support has been really critical to us into getting the word out. We had the lieutenant governor, who's featured in the middle, who gave a speech during our presentation. And We're already have plans underway for another CDFI Day, will be our second annual, coming up next year. So it's a great event. I would imagine it'd be open to any of you if you're interested in coming and seeing some of your legislators and hearing about the work that we do. Is like a lot of you probably didn't know CDFIs, and I didn't, they don't either. And so when we are looking for referral sources, it's helpful when they have our information in hand. Is there anything about CDFIs or the work of Invest in Wisconsin generally that I can answer for you at this time? Yes.
Since banks want to make money, what's their motivation?
What's the motivation of the
banks to invest
in CDFIs? Well, part of it is there's some mandates around that they need to invest X number of dollars in underserved communities. So I would say that's probably the biggest motivation. I have to say I've been overwhelmed by the support, though, that I've received in working with, especially with, I can speak the best to Chase, who I've worked with pretty closely, who recognizes that it's a niche that they're not able to serve, not well. So, a mixed bag there. Courtney, did you have a question too?
I just have some questions about, what are sort of the range of expected returns for CDFIs, and if this is in your world? Or,
yeah.
And like, what are the loan size range that these CDFIs are?
Yep. So if you're talking, you're like, what's our kind of like our default rate in terms of like or what's the percent of folks?
How much money are you looking to make?
Okay. So the returns are small, a couple percent. I'd say probably I'm looking at Samara. At the most. So, it's certainly not, investors are not in it to be making a huge profit, whether that's an investor at an organizational level or an individual level. And tell me again your second question.
What are the size of the loans?
Yes. So it depends all over the place. So with Invest in Wisconsin, because we're doing so many different types of loans, some of them are as small as $1,000. I mean, they're small. Maybe a gap loan, and some of them are over $1 million. I mean, we have a huge range of the loan sizes depending what we'd call the loan product, whether it's that small business or anything else. It's a great question. Any other questions about CDFIs? Yeah,
Actually,
wonderful.
My other question
Yeah.
would be,
do CDFIs have what I would call an impact thesis? I think you could call it a mission statement or something like that, where they sort of outline what is the social return on investment that we're looking to get, or what are the parameters around what we value as a social investment that we want to make?
That is such a good question. And my guess is probably not. I mean, I think about our professional organization, OFN, Opportunity Finance Network, talks a lot about creating economic opportunity. I'm not sure that they have an overarching social impact statement or theory of change. It's certainly something that we're all talking about in this space and trying to figure out. I've never heard of kind of a unifying, or and what part of social impact are we trying to get at? What do we believe are those pathways? I think that's the kind of work we're trying to inform to a certain extent with Invest in Wisconsin, and certainly other CDFIs as well. But it's a great question, and I should note that. I would doubt it. So actually, it's a good pivot point, though, to the next part, is really trying to unpack, first of all, what does social impact even mean? How are we measuring it? And again, I'm going to tell you, I'm with you in that I have lots of questions, and trying to, if nothing else, trying to outline what some of the specific challenges are, because I get frustrated when I go to these conferences and we just talk about evaluating social impact is so hard. And that's kind of where the conversation ends. But we don't even have we've not really broken that down into what it means. Because I think if we could break it down, none of these questions and these problems are insurmountable. It's usually an issue of time and resources, which I think we could find if we could make a good case for what the problem is. So I'll give you a general definition of social impact, knowing that, like a lot of these fun terms, especially in social sciences, There is not an agreed upon definition among the scholars. So one of them that I like is the net effect of the activities, the programs, the services, projects, and policies experienced by individuals, families, or communities. Essentially, what I'd like this to say is that the change that we see in individuals and the impact that they have is more than the dollars. It's the programs, it's the services, it's thinking of an ecological model. It's all of these different factors from the micro to the macro level that influence change in communities. This graphic is taken from Social Value International. I will outline some what I consider to be really nice key resources around learning more about social impact, and they're one of them. And they break down kind of some of the key components of social impact investment, and I've pulled out a couple actually that were highlighted by another really good organization out of Scotland, Social Impact Scotland. Talks about, again, Amy mentioned I'm a participatory researcher by training. This is a lot of that kind of same kind of stuff, for lack of a better word. Involving stakeholders, obviously. So if you want to understand what an impact has been on an individual or a community, you actually have to talk with them and get a sense of what has that impact been and kind of limit some of the assumptions about what you may believe has kind of fostered that change. Understanding and articulating that change is probably the hardest part. Again, what has been that pathway to change? I don't have that answer today. I wish I did, because then I'd really be on top of the world. But that's part of really the core of what makes this work so hard. And transparency. So going around being clear about what our assumptions are about this change process, what are our limitations, and knowing also that we can't talk with everyone kind of in the ecosystem of lending and the clients and their families, and at least not all at once. And so just being clear about what some of those limitations are. So getting into the case studies, this is where I might use my cheat sheet. As I was going through this last night, I was remembering that pregnancy brain is real, and I was forgetting names of people and their organizations. But in any event, the folks that are highlighted right in the middle are the borrowers that I spoke with this past year. The first one is Abba Thacker. She's the executive director at the Northside Planning Council, that's in Madison. And one of their big program areas is the feed kitchen, so the Food Enterprise and Economic Development feed. So we'll talk a little bit about what they're doing. The next borrower, this is Alan Danforth. He has a painting business, Go Green Painting in Green Bay, and he is a borrower of First American Capital. He's Oneida. Then we have the third one, Heather Deacon. She has a quilting shop in Salem, Wisconsin, another rural community closer to Kenosha area. Stacy Warner, she is one of our borrowers from Community Assets for People who receive down payment and rehab assistance on a home. She's a first-time home buyer. And then Marlo, whose last name I always pronounce kind of wrong. Milky, I think it is. Anyway, she's over at One City Early Learning Center. She is the director. So it's an early education center that's on the south side of Madison. The picture actually from the top is a picture from One City. It's one of their graduations of their kiddos before going to kindergarten. And a lot of the pictures here again are from this is from One City, and then this is a picture of the inside of the feed kitchen. So what I did and kind of what I started doing this year was starting a series of case studies, a multiple case study design, understanding that with the variety of lending that happens within these organizations that comprise Invest in Wisconsin and the geographic diversity, we could never just talk with one borrower and think we had that story. In fact, even talking with 5 still is pretty narrow in scope. But really wanted to have an opportunity to dig deeper as a starting point, and certainly a multiple case study design is pretty common in evaluation studies. So we talked with the folks that I outlined, and also we have extensive files, kind of case histories of each client as they onboard, kind of looking back at what's their story been, their journey up until this point before meeting with one of the Invest in Wisconsin organizations, spent a lot of time on their websites and social media, and of course, looking at scholarly research to understand the context for the kind of issues that they are addressing, whether it's food insecurity, disparities in academic outcomes, health disparities, all of that kind of work. And I can't help myself but to say that I'm a qualitative researcher, and we found that as we were starting with the implementation of that more quantitative piece that I'll talk more about, it really became obvious why looking at some of the qualitative work first was so critical, because we have so much data, and it's always important, and I've learned this the hard way, that you should pick the method that best answers your question. And truly, we couldn't look at all of this data and ask, I think, important questions without first having some insight from the borrowers around what are those pieces that really do influence, change and then outcomes within their community. So that was a personal one. I don't know if anybody else on our team really cared about that, but I did. So what I'll share with you are just some very high-level preliminary results. I think it's important to say that, again, that we've met with the borrowers just a couple times. It's really a kind of a cross-sectional point in time of what's going on in their worlds. There's certainly the intention to follow up within 6 months, 12 months, so a longitudinal approach, and also to talk with other people again in their worlds, so borrowers, families, and with the small business, with their clients and other community members, to again, as we're articulating that theory of change and involving stakeholders, making sure we're talking with enough people to get an accurate picture. But for now, in terms of the preliminary results, these are the biggest themes that emerged through our interviews and other research. This idea of autonomy came up all over the place. So for borrowers, having this investment, it's not just about the dollars. Again, they were able to pick their own schedules and have influence their environment. And so why does this matter? Because that might sound like, that's kind of it's a luxury, you get to pick your schedule. Well, so for example, Alan talked about how with his small business, he has a series of kind of chronic health conditions. He said, I finally can know that I can go to the doctor. If I have this surgery I have to do, I don't have to worry about losing my job because I'm not going to fire myself. And I have good people who are working for me. I know I can take that time off. And that was critical. Issues of autonomy also came up when I think about Stacey Warner, who's the first-time home buyer. She'd been divorced for over a decade. She has 2 kids. If any of you have rented, and you probably have, I know I have, when you live in a rented apartment, you got to ask if you want to get a cat, if you want to paint the wall, and she's trying to raise 2, young boys and young men at this point. And she's just, the way she described it, it was life-changing for her to be able to make choices about creating the home that she wanted for her family. It also came up, in the feed kitchen. So to give a little more light about what that actually is, and this is a kind of a particularly interesting case because 2 of our partners helped invest in this. One, Forward Community Investments, helped fund the nonprofit, the Northside Planning Council, and their creating of that facility for this food incubator. And then WIBIC, another one of our partners who does these small business loans, invests in the vendors who are creating food products within the feed space, which is pretty cool. But for many of these folks, they would never be able to afford, so many people would not be able to afford a commercial kitchen space to get off the ground, to get started. And so they're able to have this sense of autonomy in their business in a space that's affordable, and they can pick their schedules. They don't have to commit to 9 to 5 every day. It's a huge deal for them in elevating their businesses to the next level. It just came up time and again. Heather mentioned the same thing in her work with her quilting shop, just the critical nature of being able to have that kind of freedom, which we often don't see in low-income jobs. Giving back, I thought this was amazing. We're talking about, as CDFIs, we're revolving loan funds, we're constantly recycling capital in communities. The borrowers are doing the same thing. They are immediately looking for opportunities to influence their own environments, their own communities in a number of ways. Whether that's hiring family members to work with them and building stronger relationships. I think my first conversation was with Alan at the paint shop, and he's kind of this big guy, and I hadn't met him before, and he just melted talking about his family. He was really emotional about it, that he could support his daughters in creating jobs for them and also opportunities for other Native workers in his community. That was really important for him. I could tell he had a lot of pride in being able to create jobs in his community. We saw this, I'm trying to think of some of the other places where I saw the giving back. Also Heather, she talked about how she's created quilts at her shop that they've donated to a local cancer organization. They also save all of their scrap material for the local humane society to create pillows. I mean, people are looking for opportunities. I guess that's the overarching idea here. People are looking for opportunities in their own worlds to give back, even in a small way. And we do actually see kind of on a bigger level in CDFIs and I saw this yesterday with WIBIC's big celebration, is some of the borrowers, once they've reached a certain amount of economic success, they become impact investors in these organizations, and they are putting their dollars towards funding other businesses. So it's really a beautiful model. The piece about equity. This came up all over the place. How social impact, investment has the ability to address so many types of equity, whether that is looking at, again, education gaps that came up at first, One City Early Learning Centers. It came up with Alan a lot because if you look at kind of the research around we're talking in terms of racial and ethnicity in terms of who's starting small businesses. Native communities are starting them at much lower rates than some other groups. So addressing disparities in terms of racial disparities in terms of who's starting a small business. All of these types of equity, racial, socioeconomic, gender, really struck a chord with Feed Kitchen. Again, look at kind of the food enterprise as its own being, its own entity, lots of disparities in terms of who's starting businesses, who's profiting from those businesses, and the fact that they're able to look at their vendors and say we've got a huge number of women, minorities, veterans, folks who are older, who are starting businesses, was a big deal. So this, I'm looking at my list of borrowers, that really touched on everyone. Stacy, again, the woman who has a first-time homeowner, said, I just never believed that this was possible for me to own a home. And she's like, I'm so frustrated. I've lived in the same place for 10 years. The rent keeps going up. No changes have made whatsoever. And here I am trying to raise a family, and I never thought this would be possible for me. And the last one, and this is where it gets tricky, because when we start thinking about the world of kind of the more quantitative evaluation, how we kind of measure change and measure outcomes, not totally sure what to do with this one. So this idea of outlook change, the idea that a borrower suddenly has a sense of confidence, empowerment, that was the word they're using, in a way that they never have before. Alan said to me, I've never been able to sit at a table with a group of business people before and feel confident saying anything. And now I do. I'm a small business owner. Alan in particular highlighted something for me that I think is really critical to get out there, which is that he earned a minority business entrepreneur certificate. And lots of, especially government contracts, need to hire a certain number of minority-owned businesses. I'm getting head nods here, so you all know what I'm talking about. Good. And so once he received this certification, he's in this pool of potential applicants. He's getting bids that he doesn't, he's getting so many of them, he can't even respond. He was so proud. He took out his phone and showed me. He's like, these are all the bids I got in the last 2 days. I can't even answer all of them. So it's amazing. And he said it's not the money. It's the feeling that people want a service I have to offer, and I know I'm good at it. And really across the board, every single one of them said that. Heather was funny though. She said, and small business owners will tell you this. Yeah, there's a great amount of confidence. She's like, I'm also working harder than I ever have in my whole life. However, other people in my world tell me that I am happier, less stressed. Other people notice it. Other people notice. She's like, other people notice that I lost weight before I did because I just felt better. I was sleeping better. So it comes up all the time, these kind of health impacts. I would say health came up a lot in this space also in terms of the outlook change, because the outlook change, I think, fostered some behavioral changes as well. They really do go hand in hand. So as much as I do love the qualitative stuff, I have to say that the funders and even other nonprofits do get really excited when we start getting into the numbers, and partially because we need them so much for our funders and getting the word out. in marketing and whatnot. So we, perhaps naively, undertook the process of implementing a social impact measurement software platform. We are very much in the implementation phase of this work, which has gone on for months and probably will go on for several more months. So, have me back in a year when I have some more of the results here, and I think we'll have a really interesting story to tell. But at least for right now, SoPact is the name of the software vendor. They're out in Silicon Valley that has created this platform that's really aimed at trying to measure social impact. And there are many functions to this platform. We've kind of thrown them a curveball in a couple of ways for two reasons. One, they've never worked with CDFIs before. And second, we're trying to not only look at the social impact by these individual organizations, but also across organizations. And remember that across organizations, we have like 10 different types of lending. The size of those loans is all over the place. The geographic scope is all over the place. So it's no small undertaking, what we're trying to do. One of the things that caught my eye as we were looking to select one of these platforms was there's a feature around formula for social return on investment and trying to measure what the social return on the investment has been. And if you recall, at the beginning of the presentation, I was talking about how funders and investors usually just look at what's the return on the investment ROI, and that's the financial return, the economic return. This is trying to get at what is that social return, and I have learned, though, that that's a very underutilized feature in this product, again, because it's so hard, and it is so hard. I don't mean to like act like it's not, but it's interesting to me that we're one of the first organizations that's actually trying to figure that piece of it out. And so for this work, I hired an absolutely fabulous woman she's kind of been my interface between the software vendor, she speaks data in this kind of way that I don't. And there have been times where we've kind of just been knocking heads because it's so frustrating. And I said, well, if nothing else, we're starting to create this list of specific challenges that unpack that idea of why is this so hard. So I'm going to share with you some of those why is this so hard challenges. And if nothing else, if we can get that word out, again, I think if we can at least uncover the problem, we can start to address it. And to a certain extent, we've covered some of these. The biggest hurdle is the variation in lending products again. So we've got folks who are doing small business lending, nonprofit lending, auto lending. But so why is that so hard? Okay, so first I thought to myself, what would be some consistent data around certain metrics that all of these organizations would have to track in the same way? So they're all CDFIs, and the Department of Treasury requires a certain number, a certain amount of data around certain metrics to be reported every year in a standard way. They all did that. Okay, so that report is like, tracks like 1 million different data points. And again, depending on what kind of CDFI you are and what kind of lending you do, you only have to fill out certain questions. So the number of questions that each of them actually had filled out, the same, were like 5. So I got the amount of the loan, the date of the loan that was closed, where it was located, and a couple other key points that kind of get at social impact. For example, is it a low-income borrower? Well, yes, everyone is. Is it a woman-owned business, or is it a woman who's receiving the loan? And sometimes, depending on the lending product, they'll track race sometimes. So, okay, so I have a few points across all the organizations that start to tell a story, but even within those, oh my gosh, got something like zip code. Some folks are tracking it as a 5-digit number. Some are tracking it as XY coordinates. And we were talking like thousands of loans that were going in. I mean, this is not like 10 where it's easy to go back and forth. Thousands of loans that we have to kind of, oh my gosh. So, and that's small potatoes. That was the easy stuff. Another huge piece that we're bumping up against with nonprofits, and I want to say these are some of the most hardworking, phenomenal people I work with, and the piece around data integrity and data cleanliness is just a struggle. Even if you have an organization that has a dedicated compliance officer, we just find a lot of inconsistencies, and there are a lot of reasons for that. For example, again, folks need to track certain metrics for a variety of funders, and 10 funders may have 10 different definitions of what they mean by a leverage ratio. And so then when I'm trying to compile data across organizations that have 4 different, at least in my case, 4 different definitions of leverage ratios, and they're completely different, and I don't know what I'm doing, at least, I'm learning, and it gets messy really, really, really fast. We also find that, one of the organizations I work with, this one where it's a subsidiary of a bigger organization, some of their lending is part of the bigger organization and some of it's part of the subsidiary, and it's tracked in different ways and different people, and they don't talk to each other. If you're getting overwhelmed, welcome to my world. It's just, it gets messy. But again, as we've actually spent the time in digging into it, we've been able to identify, okay, and again, it's a ton of time working with our partners to say, okay, we know where your errors are. Can we work with you to fix them? And, it's a struggle, but we've been able to do it on a small scale. We've thought about, is it possible to create a statewide network of CDFIs and track their data around social impact? And I still have high hopes that we could do that, but I'm learning that even around these few number of metrics that in theory everyone's supposed to report in the same way, it's really hard. I am more optimistic that we started the wrong way, trying to do these overarching models of change across organizations. Now when we look at specific organizations, they do each have areas that they focus on and track data in kind of more specific ways. So whether it's around racial equity and specific metrics around that, I think we'll be able to tell more interesting stories and create more interesting models at that level of the individual organization. Yet to be seen. But I think the biggest takeaway message is the idea that this theory of change work, it's hard and it's time consuming. And I laugh because I looked back at my position description when I was writing, I think it was when I became an affiliate for CommNS. And I was looking back to try to figure out what was it that they had told me I was going to do in my position so I could write something about what I do. And the partners said they wanted to create an equity-based theory of change across all of the organizations. And these are smart people, but frankly, I don't think they knew what they were talking about when they wrote that. And I'm sure I didn't know what I was talking about when I said, oh yeah, I can totally do that, no problem. It's what we do at job interviews, no problem. So, I think I have an idea of what that would take, but I'm telling you, it's like hundreds of hours of sitting down with, again, multiple stakeholders, really asking ourselves, even if you just think about a logic model, basics, so taking a step back, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, what are the outcomes, what are all these different pieces, and agreeing upon what is that pathway of change. Oh my gosh, and I'm working with the executive directors most of the time who, I don't know how they get anything done. I mean, they're just working all the time, and I'm trying to pull this from them in our one monthly meeting, and it is really challenging. Now, again, I don't think it's impossible, but it's about dedicated time, resources to doing that hard work and not just talking about it, these are obviously very different things. So in terms of some resources that I think are kind of ahead of the game and maybe, important in terms of shaping this conversation, I realize I probably also should have put the Rockefeller Foundation up here, because as a funder, they've been looking at issues of social impact for a long time, though I just saw a piece they put out just a couple months ago in preparation for the American Evaluation Association, and basically they're saying too it's really hard and we're still trying to figure it out. But they're a good resource. I've seen them talk about it a lot. So SOPACT, again, this is our software vendor. I'm not promoting it per se, but they do have a really nice resource tab in a blog that talks about social impact investment and evaluation. I think at a really a practitioner level that I have found more useful than most of the stuff that's out there. It's fabulous. I mean, I've gotten blog posts from them before, and I thought, are you reading my mind? Because my biggest question is, okay, you have all this data, it tells a story, blah, 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 and then what do you do with it? Like, why does it even matter? How is it affecting communities? How is having that data doing anything to address disparities in ways that are not just meaningful for the funders and for marketing purposes, but for communities? I don't know the answer to that yet, but I'm working on it. Again, as a participatory researcher, I can't do this work without asking those questions. The GIN, and this is another one where I told myself I was going to look up what that meant because I forgot, the Global Impact Investment Network. I think. Oh, I'm getting some nods. Okay, so I got that. So again, a network really involved in impact investment, and I'll highlight, of course, their IRIS, which is their repository of social impact metrics. Now, being kind of the snob I am around metrics, I will say that what I call a lot of what's there is what we call widgets. The kind of widgets that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. So number of housing units, how do you looking at issues of health disparities, as well as the number of kids that have come in for a certain vaccine, number of this, number of that. And I certainly think there's value in having that information, so I certainly want to discount that. But it is a huge and very valuable repository of social impact metrics. So you'll often see referenced. Social Value International, again, huge and leading the charge around social impact and evaluation, that worked in partnership with the American Evaluation Association for last year, had their first, what they call their Impact Convergence Conference, which was kind of a preamble to the American Evaluation Conference that was specific to understanding and evaluating social impact. And they didn't do that conference again this year, but AEA did create one of their topical interest groups, their TIGs, if you're familiar with those, that's called Social Impact Measurement. And I put a link there to that page because I thought they did a nice job of highlighting some of the key presentations that would happen at AEA and some of the key resources, and they've been really responsive in terms of answering questions. So I just think these are actually some pretty good resources. If you're interested in getting more information, I'm happy to share this info with Amy if that's helpful. So final, of course, shout out to our funders, Pro Neighborhoods, JP Morgan Chase, they've been great. Again, really good partners in doing this work and advancing the work around social impact. And with that, thank you.